Good morning, everyone. We're delighted you could be here, and we hope you noticed that on the back table there are some sandwiches along with the usual cookies and other things to drink. So please avail yourself of that. We're delighted this morning to welcome Mary Larkin for this program entitled A Culture of Compassion, Understanding Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. Our presenter is a lead consultant within diversity, equity, and inclusion at Trinity Health here in Washtenaw County. And Mary, prior to working at Trinity, spent 15 years in higher education supporting marginalized students and staff from many different backgrounds and experiences. She's also served as an adjunct lecturer in educational leadership at EMU, where she received a master's degree in health education. And I learned from chatting with Mary that she is very wise and knowledgeable about the Ann Arbor community, the Ypsilanti community, and told me of a whole lot of new restaurants to try. So Mary is a wonderful source. Don't forget to ask. So thank you, Mary. We welcome you this morning.
Thank you, and good morning or afternoon, I guess, depending on how you define this part of the day. I'm so glad to be in a space that has sunlight. It's been quite Michigan. I know that we love that when we get it. So really glad to be here. You got a little bit of my background, and so I've been doing diversity work for about 20 years, and I like to also just say that sometimes people look at me and think that can't be possible, but I was born in the mid-70s. I just have a very youthful face, and so I spent a lot of time working. When I was at EMU, I started doing consulting outside of higher education, and so I landed in a lot of places that I didn't think I would ever be standing. Similar to this moment, if you would have asked me 10 years ago if I thought I'd be talking about sexual orientation and gender identity in a church, it was the same way I felt about working for a Catholic healthcare organization. I just never thought that was my trajectory in life. And so I made the joke that Trinity Health has given me a little bit of credibility in the religious communities in having these conversations. And so some of the places that I have been in that I thought, well, I never thought that would happen. A Big Ten football team that's nearby. Police departments, PTA boards with parents and families. I'm speaking to 1,000 radiologists in April. It's my first keynote, and I thought, well, again, if you would have said, where do you think your first keynote, it wouldn't be 1,000 radiologists. But what I've learned is that the piece of paper they have in front of them and the body that's behind x-rays gets confusing when we're talking about gender and sexual orientation. And I say that because this really sounds the same no matter who's in front of me and the conversation. It's just the context that changes a little bit. And so again, grateful to be here, and hopefully we'll get some questions answered. So you can go ahead and forward. Sorry, I'm gonna have to let them know to do that. You don't need to see this. This is more for me than it is for you, because I have a habit of getting off track. I know myself really well. We don't necessarily need to talk through in detail what we are gonna do today, but I do like to set expectations of what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to talk about the Bible because it's not my lane. I don't really know how to do that well, but my hope is that the conversation that we do have, you all are able to apply and have those conversations. And I say that a lot of times. How many people are familiar with the word ally? So a lot of times people say, well, you come and do an ally training. And I say, I don't know. Who are they? And did you tell them they have to be there? Because some people don't want to be allies, and I think that's okay. What And so in like healthcare, when I talk to doctors, I don't talk about allyship because I don't think that matters when we just want to be kind and compassionate and use the right language. You don't have to be an ally to do that. And so I say that knowing that that might sound a little different for people. And so what we will do, hopefully, is talk about a little bit of language. I know that it changes a lot, sometimes from the last presentation that I do. And then I say something, and I realize, oh, we're not using that language anymore. Two people have already come up and said, are you gonna talk about? And I said, yes, I am. And there'll probably be some questions. Because what I've learned is that things happened a lot faster, I think, than we were ready for. I hear a lot of people say, I was okay with the gay stuff, or the gay thing. And that's it's okay to just say that. But the gender stuff is getting challenging for some folks, especially, and I say this intergenerationally, I'll be asked to go to a high school to talk to students. And I say, I don't need to talk to them. They're smarter than me around this. But who I do need to talk to are the people, like myself even, who just aren't used to all the new words that are out there. And so that's what I hope we can do today. Does that make enough sense? Okay. We can keep on going. And so I call these ways of being. I think that you are all here because you chose to be. Am I right about that? Sorry, don't tell me any differently. If somebody dragged you along, that's your problem, not mine. And so it sounds different. When I'm in a room full of 200 people that were forced to be in a space to have this conversation, the ways of being look different. But when I know that folks are choosing to come here, I think because we want to learn more, the things that I ask of ourselves in this space is this idea of lived experience, that if someone says that that's their experience, we just believe them and we don't try to argue with that. And sometimes that's hard. But I say that as somebody who shares a lot of my own lived experience, and I know that that's not everyone else's experience. Just because, not that you're making assumptions about me, but I do look like this, and I know what I look like, and you're right about assumptions you would make, that I am a gay woman. That doesn't give me all the information that I need about trans people or other identities, and so I don't think that I'm an expert in other people's experiences. The second part, and I'm gonna ask you to share this with me. When you're in a group setting like this, and let's say I ask a question, and I want you to answer. Are you someone who's gonna say, I would love to try to answer that? You would be a 5 on my rating scale. You're comfortable talking, you wanna say, I wanna try to talk about this. Even if I'm wrong, that's okay. Or are you someone who's gonna turn your head the moment I ask a question? Like, I don't wanna, and that's okay too. But my hope is that everyone can kind of move in the middle, because the best way I know, if you're a little nervous, right? How many people are nervous using the word queer? Just like you don't use it that often. Okay, you had to think, you're like, I don't know, nervous. Yeah, are you nervous that like you don't know what it means maybe? That's okay. And that's in these spaces, I think it's absolutely okay to say, I'm not even sure what you just said. That's okay. But I say that in the space because what I learn is if you are someone who is really knowledgeable, folks will want you to do the talking. And what I learn is that we learn by messing up and realizing in the moment that we're messing up. We're like, oh, I think non-binary. And you just try. You try it out. And the last piece is that it is perfectly okay to raise your hand at any moment and stop me and say, can you say that again? Or I have a question about that. Because, like I said, how long are we here? Like an hour more, I think. Sometimes these are 6-hour sessions broken into 2, 2, and 2. Sometimes they're on different days, so people can think about it and come back. And so I don't want to move faster than we're ready to in this space, if that makes sense as well. So is that okay? We on board so far? I don't know what happens if someone says no. I've been told you should never ask a question with a microphone that you're not prepared to answer, so I'm going to try not to do that, and we can move forward. The font is white because I didn't have time to do it. You don't need to see what that says. I'm about to ask a question, but first I want you to just talk with each other at your table. You don't have to raise your hand. And the question is, where have you gotten your knowledge or experience talking about LGBT people? And we'll talk about the acronym in a little bit. And let me back up, because SOGI was the name of the title, right, of the presentation. And again, language is all over the place. SOGI stands for sexual orientation and gender identity. Sometimes people say LGBT. Sometimes people say LGBTQ. Sometimes they add a plus. Sometimes there's an I and an A. Sometimes there's two Qs. Do you need to be an expert on that? You don't. It's helpful to know what those words mean, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But I just want you to share with people that are around you, where have you learned what you've learned about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people and topics? And I'm gonna give you like 4 minutes, and then I'm gonna come back and see if you'll share some of that in this room. Make sense? Okay, good luck. I have faith in you. About 30 more seconds to start to wrap up. Okay, I would like to applaud you for talking, because that's the first step, so good job. And I'm wondering if a few folks will just share their perspective, maybe what they shared. And you don't necessarily have to tell the story. So a lot of times folks will say like, well, I think my third grade teacher was gay and I liked her a lot. You don't necessarily have to tell the whole story, but just where did you get some of the information and knowledge that you have about LGBT people?
I teach high school in the area, so that's where it came to me. And then we were just talking about different populations, and a family member is dating someone who is a veteran, but is also newly transgender. So, and sometimes in my mind still, I'm like, veteran, no, yes.
Sure.
So yeah.
Yeah.
I've been taught on the job.
And so let's just take a check here. What I hear is that personal experience, you know someone who is dating someone who identifies within the LGBTQ community. How many of you have an answer similar to that, where you know a person in your life? Not just a person, sorry, an LGBTQ person. That would be weird. You're like, I do know a person, I can raise my hand. Yeah, so great example. And teaching high school will surely, yes, when I worked at a college for 10 years, I thought I cannot keep up. I'm trying so hard, so that's great.
I had a good friend at the University of Michigan who taught in the engineering department, a professor, and who had been a man when working at IBM. After she left there, was a woman teaching, and she has a terrific website, so resource for people. Lynn Conway is her name. You may.
LYNN, do you know?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I do. Conway.
Okay.
And so lots of resources. There's the University Ombudsman, people who talk to me about lots of different issues, and that was a go-to resource.
Great. Yeah, so someone that you worked with, also a great resource. Lynn Conway was the name, and I commend you for using pronouns during the story. Well done. We'll talk about that in a moment too. You get a star. I'm doling out stars today.
Our closest friends as a family, their daughter was gay, and she just had a lot of problems before the family knew about it. And then her partner's parents kicked her out of the house and told her never to come back. So these parents were parents to both of them. And it isn't something, as my friend's daughter would say, why would I choose to be the most, probably most, but people think less of than anybody else. And so I've lived with that for years and seen how she allowed her first partner die, and now she has the second partner. So happy family on both sides, and it's so different from the other. But that these parents helped both girls for the years that one lived.
Yeah, those personal experiences, I think, at least when folks share with me, people who have personal experiences that they experience, I just said that twice, I tend to think that it's then easier for folks to open themselves up to learning when you can associate a person, that you care about. I have unfortunately played that role in my life. If you can't tell, I use humor quite often to get people to draw in. I am from a very small town in Ohio, not very compared to other small towns, North Ridgeville, Ohio, and it is home of the Corn Festival. Still happens every August. It's so fascinating 25 years later how many people say things to me like, you were the first, or you're one of the only, or now I have children. I have multiple classmates that have a trans child. And they say things like, had I not known a person, this would have been harder. But when we can humanize that and know that there is a heart and a brain behind those things, it's helpful. So I appreciate those stories, and there's going to be more time for you to share those. And the thing, and I think we're getting there, is just because we know people doesn't mean we have the language that we need to talk, and I say to people or about people. Because the language, even if there's not a LGBT person around, we should still be trying our hardest to use the right language so that we're used to using the right language. And if you're like, well, what is the right language? The right language is better, even if you can't use the right language, not using the wrong language. So some words, and we'll get there, that are, I think, and not to everyone. People are not monolithic, right? So just because I say something doesn't mean that every single LGBT person thinks that. So for instance, the word lifestyle doesn't feel good usually to people, because lifestyle, rich and famous. We also use lifestyle a lot in around things like addiction, and so lifestyle and preference kind of denotes choice. Like you had said, that the young person said, why would I choose this? Why would I choose something that's so hard? And so those are words usually to steer a little clear of if we're trying to build relationships and trust with people. And the other thing that I say a lot is how I said topics and people, LGBTQ topics and people, because a lot of times people ask me to come and talk about LGBTQ issues. And I say, well, what's wrong? Because that sounds bad. And sometimes we can just talk about that without there being a negative connotation. So I'm careful about, again, trying to use the right words in that. So we can go ahead and go forward. I have to look because I don't know what comes next. Even though I've done this for 15 years, I still am like, oh, there it is. So I want to talk just a minute about sexual orientation so we can talk about gender. Because sometimes people mesh those together, sometimes they don't know which one goes where. And so I really like TESR. This is an acronym, it stands for Trans Students Educational Resources. And like I said, young people are really driving a lot of the education that's happening right now. And so they kind of use the most up-to-date language. And the way that they kind of consensus, how do we talk about sexual orientation? They say it is a person's physical, romantic, emotional, aesthetic, and or other form of attraction to others. And part of that is helpful because everyone has a sexual orientation. So we don't have to talk about gay people, right? Sexual orientation, that means the same thing for everybody, mostly. And so on the next slide, there's a triangle that I put together when I was talking to 8th grade health teachers. It was a conference for 8th grade health teachers. And what I learned really quickly in that space is how uncomfortable they were. And they're teaching young people. And so a few things happened where I said, you don't have to talk about necessarily about being gay. You can just talk about it a little more inclusively. And so this was helpful at the time with these folks. So for some people, who you're attracted to kind of dictates who you do what with and how you identify yourself. It's a neat, nifty little triangle. For queer people, and I'm gonna say queer as we go, it's faster, okay? Doesn't mean that everybody aligns with that word, it's just faster. For queer people, it's sometimes not that easy. And so I wanna talk about this for a second. If you had to define attraction just in one word, using a different word, what would you say? How do you define attraction? Magnetism. Great job. 2 gold stars. Keep track. You get a free cookie. Butterflies. Great. Yep, butterflies, who we like, right? What we're drawn to. And sometimes that happens really quickly. We look at a person and we just think, that's nice. Right? Whatever that means. And it can look and sound and feel really different. Now what happens, what I've learned with folks who get a little uncomfortable with these conversations, it's that next piece. It's the behavior piece. It's what people are doing. And I say, why do we have to talk about that? Unless we're in a medical conversation or a therapy session or we don't even have to really talk about that, because the next piece of that, identity, so if attraction is who and what we like, and behavior is what we do and who we do it with, how would you define identity very simply? Great, yes. 3 gold stars. It just keeps getting more and more. It's who we are, and who we are is regardless of what we're doing. And I say that because I am a gay woman no matter what. Like I am right now, just like a straight person is. So people who, let's talk, again, I said I'm not talking about the Bible, but here I go. It's not. People who wait to consummate their marriage, right? They're still straight. Like there's a guy and there's a man and there's a woman, and they decide that they're not doing that until they get married. They still have a sexual orientation. But when we talk especially about youth, we think, well, how could they know? If they haven't kissed somebody, because we just know. People just know. You knew when you had a crush in 6th grade, just like a young gay person does. And so I always start with this triangle to just say, whew, it's complicated. Sometimes it makes really good sense and sometimes it's confusing. And that's okay, as long as we don't get stuck in the behavior. We really want to stay in the identity, because the identity is the heart and the brain and who we are as people. And so on the next slide, there's some words that you've probably seen before. I like to use refrigerator magnets because it seems nicer. Did you nudge him? What are you doing back there? You playing Candy Crush? Don't worry, I know him. So I like to use things, I don't know how familiar you are with the city of Howell, Michigan. I was asked to go to the Howell Nature Center to talk to 250 7th graders. They were there for a weekend retreat, and they came from all over, so they weren't just from Howell. They were from all areas of kind of southeast Michigan. And then I found out that their parents were going to be there too, a day before, and that's a different conversation. So I changed the slide to this because it feels nicer. And there are words up here that you've seen probably, right? Lesbian. What's a lesbian? This isn't a trick question. A woman who likes a woman. Great, thank you. Straight, I assume you've heard. Straight, heterosexual, great, okay. We're not gonna spend a lot of time there. Pansexual, please raise your hand if you have heard of pansexual. We got a hand back there, we got some hands, don't worry, I'm not gonna be like, tell everyone. How many people, is this the first time you're hearing the word pansexual? Great. I'm gonna skip ahead so we can talk about pansexual. Bisexual you've heard though, right? Okay, what does bisexual mean to most people when you think of it? I'm saying most people, not all people. I like the men and women, too, right? Now this doesn't go for everybody, stay with me. The word pan means what? Great, all. So for some folks, it's just a more inclusive term because pan means all, so it's not boxing in to men and women. Because when we talk about gender, don't worry, you don't have to know all the words coming out of my mouth. We have non-binary, gender non-conforming, trans, people who are transitioning that might not feel like they fit into man and woman. Now, there's bisexual folks who are like, I didn't mean that. And so now even the language around bisexuality is changing to mean the binary, which is men and women, and also maybe anybody else. But it's also important to know that there are people who do not want to put trans people in a category because there is, in the LGBTQ community, a lot of, I don't even know what word to use, hatred for trans people within the LGB community. I know, it's very tricky. And it's sad. And it's something that the communities are really working to and for to figure out. And some people don't want to figure that out. And so pansexual is used with younger people a lot more. Bisexual is an identity that, especially if somebody carried for decades, they want to hold on to that. And it doesn't mean that they don't love trans people. Does that make sense? Okay. So pansexual, bisexual. The word gay, how do you define the word gay? A man and a man. But then see how I came in here and messed all that up? Because I said I was like, I'm a gay woman. And I use the word gay all the time. I always have. And again, it doesn't matter other than it's individual for people. People use the language that is comfortable for them to use. There's no reason. Maybe it's because it's shorter. I don't know. I just say it. It's quicker. And my friends have called in on me about that because, not called in on me, but my gender, we'll talk about this in a little bit, is masculine a little bit. And so is that why I use the word gay? I don't know. Even I don't know these things.
I've always thought of it as same sex.
Yeah,
So it could be
either. Yeah, she said that thinking of gay as same sex instead of when we say, yeah, a man and a woman are heterosexual. And I'll talk about the last two in a moment. This brings me to the word homosexual. Not a word that goes over really well. Now, are there men who identify as homosexual? Yes. But it's not something to assume. And again, I say this with love and kindness in my heart, the word homosexual has really been weaponized by religious communities. And so it doesn't feel great when people say that word without having that context. And so that's just another one of those, the more you know, why that might be the case. And so those last two, asexual, right? People are like, these are made up words. What is, yeah, I have a funny story to tell you in a moment about that. How many folks have heard of asexuality? Most of the room, okay. I think an easy way, and again, it's on a spectrum, it's different for everyone. Asexuality is a person that is not driven by sexual desire. It doesn't mean that they never think about it. Sometimes they do, occasionally, and it looks different for everyone. I told you that I spoke to a football team once. I was doing the same song and dance, and I got to this part, and this is when they were like, no way. Like, they could talk about gay men, they could talk about lesbians, but I got to asexuality, and they were like, that's not true. And I was like, I didn't think we were gonna get stuck there, but okay. And it's important to note that this asexuality has really been put in the LGBTQ community, but it isn't just LGBTQ people. There are absolutely straight people who identify as asexual, and they don't really feel like they have a place and space in the world that is not in this community. So, and then that brings us to the word queer. Is someone willing to try to say out loud what they think the word queer means?
I would just like to say that I think that word has probably like all of them, has changed so much.
Mm-hmm.
I'm of an age.
Right.
That, I mean, that was just the worst thing you could say about someone when I was
Yeah.
back in the 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There's an evolution. And for older folks that even identify, they don't want you to use that word. I learned that the hard way at Trinity Health.
I just steered clear of it because I didn't want to be misunderstood or offend somebody when I used it.
Sure. Yeah, no, you are absolutely right. It has evolved. Again, a word that young folks are using quite often. It's not a term that is negative within the community. But I, like you, I remember playing with all the boys in the neighborhood. We played Smear the Queer. And I think back and I'm like, wow. But it's those kind of things that we don't even realize get put in our brain. And so, again, it is a word. And the thing that I say is, we can be uncomfortable using certain words. I appreciate if you're like, I don't want to use it wrong, so I'm just not going to use it. If someone tells you that's what they use, let it fly. Then it's okay. But that's exactly what had happened. So when I got to the Trinity Health organization, when I had my interview 4 years ago, there was a panel of people interviewing me. And I just asked the question, and it was not confusing. My whole resume was like gay, 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 because I ran an LGBT resource center. So it's just like on the resume. So that wasn't confusing. They knew who I was coming into that. So we're sitting there and I said, so I work at System Office, which is like the headquarters. It's non-clinical, and I work across the whole system. It's like 26 states. It's a big organization, 133,000 people. And I said to these folks who work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, I said, are there queer people that work here? And they were like, what? And I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. And they were uncomfortable. I could tell that they were uncomfortable. And they were like, well, I'm sure. And I was like, oh, okay. And so when I got there, I did not think I would be doing LGBTQ work. I was excited to do broader work. I am leading the organizational efforts for anti-racism and unconscious bias. But the moment that I showed up, you bet there were LGBTQ people that worked there. And they're coming up to my cubicle like, hi, what are we doing? And now, and I'm not saying that this is due to my part, they have a colleague resource group. There are 34 colleague resource groups, and it's the second largest colleague resource group across the organization in 4 years. There's hundreds of people that are now part of this. And I say all of that because representation matters. If folks don't know that they're allowed to be authentic and exist, and we were chatting about this out in putting a flag up isn't the work. It's just not. And that's good. I love that. I'm not saying don't put the flag up, but you have to be able to back that up. And at Trinity, that's the thing. Let's not say inclusive and belonging when we weren't able to identify whether there were any LGBT people here, who now hundreds of them are like, thank you, I'm gonna be in this organization. But watching them, it is not easy. Our CEO and president, I adore, and I have hard conversations where he's like, just help me out, because he does believe in reverence for all people. He believes in the Catholic mission. And so that's an easy place to land, to say if we believe in reverence and the divineness of every being, then it should be an easy conversation to care for people, to be kind to people. And so, circling all the way back to the hard lesson that I learned, we put out, it was called The More You Know. It was a digital education series, the first June that I worked there during Pride Month. And the very first line at the top was, it's okay to use the word queer. And we didn't provide a link or a reason. And so many men who are older, who are gay, who worked there, were like, I don't want people to say queer. And okay, I had a learning moment there. We pushed too hard, too fast, where they were like, it doesn't feel good to me. And then you also have people who, quite frankly, are just homophobic, who are like, we didn't want that either. And so now it's like, oh, okay, we got to take 10 steps back. So I say that as somebody driving the work and also messing it up quite often. The word queer, tricky. If we invited 50 people who identify as queer into this room and said, tell them what it means, it wouldn't be helpful. You would be like, that all sounded really different. And that's the important piece to know. It looks and sounds different for every individual, and usually they just don't want to adhere to the words that have already been kind of boxed in, what it means to say gay or lesbian, that it's just, I don't know where I have to go, but my alarm just went off. It just is it's more open, it more functions on a spectrum. And so I will pause there before we move into gender identity. Are there questions about any of that or thoughts in this space that will feel helpful before we talk about gender? Okay, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going back here first.
Can you just say more about that word you just used when you said spectrum?
Yeah, so I said it for asexuality and I said it for queer, meaning that it can, some queer people say that it's just absolutely out of the box. No label is ever going to feel like something that makes sense for them. And that's over here. And some people, the word queer just means, I know I'm not straight. I just know that I'm not straight. And there are so many words and we don't need to get into it. It will blow your mind. But demisexual, you have asexual. People use words like homoflexible. Heteroflexible. I think they mean the same thing, but I'm told they don't. So it's like, okay. And usually what that means is, if I say that I am homoflexible, it means I'm in a differently gendered partnership. So a married, let's say like a man and a woman are married. It's so hard for me to talk about straight people. I don't know why. Like I can talk about gay people and they're like a person that's married. So you got a man and a woman and they're married and the woman is attracted to other women. She might say, I'm homoflexible, but she's married. She's in a monogamous and committed relationship and she recognizes that she's attracted to women. And this goes back to the triangle, the spectrum, that you can be attracted to people and it doesn't necessarily mean that that's your identity. This happens, I have a friend I knew since college. She's been married to her high school sweetheart. Tim, I think I make his name up every time, but let's call him Tim. They have been married for 20 some years. She identifies as bisexual. And people always are like, but why? You're in a committed monogamous relationship with Tim. And she's like, because I'm still bisexual. The identity really matters, and it matters to her to be seen and understood as a bisexual person because she still loves women. Wouldn't that be great if when we got married, we stopped being attracted to people? That would help the divorce rate, just like in general. But that's not how it works. We're still attracted to people. It is a choice to engage in behavior. Spectrum. Thank you. What a great question. Oh, see, I shouldn't have said it. So the word demi and gray, like the color gray, are used a lot around gender and sexual orientation. The way that I have heard it described to me many times is that it's like if you say that you are, like you're gay and you know that you're gay. Demi and gray are like, and like people use, you may have heard, is it sapiosexual? Which is, and it just keeps going. You think I'm making things up, I'm not. But that is when people say that they are mostly attracted to a person the way a person thinks. It doesn't come up first that it is gender, and that's similar with pansexuality. Like the gender doesn't matter as much as the person matters. Thanks for that. Sometimes I don't know the answer to questions. Yeah.
Just to say that with all of the words, and I don't, and we do want to know, you're telling us what we want to know. But my frustration in talking to loved ones that are going through stuff is the feeling that people have to be put in a box, that we have to use labels, period. And it's, I think for those of us who grew up in what was supposed, that heterosexual seemed to be the only thing you acknowledged, was that, you realize, oh, not everybody's the same. We all have different characteristics, and either we accept them or we don't. And so I think that's a little bit of the frustration that comes now, is that having to affix a label to, and such specific labels.
Yeah, and that we think we know what it means when there's a label.
And people don't change over time and become aware of different aspects of themselves over time.
Yeah, that's a great point. I want to talk about that for a second. I don't know if you've ever seen, there's an image of an iceberg that we use when we talk about the diversity of people. And I always took issue with the iceberg because what it meant was that when we see an iceberg, there's only about 10% on the surface, right? And all of the underneath that we don't know is there. And so whoever they are that made this the first time, they put things that we can see on top and then the things that we don't know on the bottom. And I was like, sexual orientation? Like, I know sometimes we can look at a person and be like, yeah, they're probably gay. Don't do that, but I get it. I get that that's a thing that happens. But it changes. And so that's the conversation that I have with folks around like reporting, right? When they're like, well, we want people to be able to check the box. Like this is happening at Trinity. And I'm like, bah, have you ever talked to a queer person? Like 2 years ago, similar to what you had said, especially if someone transitions, we'll talk about that in a second, their identity changes as they transition depending on who they are attracted to. That was like an algebra equation. But we're gonna talk about it 2 slides from now. But to that, there is a lot of frustration around one, it's constantly evolving. So careful when we use those labels and when we don't. But fair to be frustrated. Was there one more? Was there another question?
You answered it.
Great. I'm so smart. Just kidding.
I was gonna say that.
Well, yeah.
Queer come in. I thought a queer person was just somebody that did something really stupid.
Yes.
I wanted, it would have been a nice thing for me to say about anybody, but I certainly didn't put it in this conversation.
Yeah. And I forget, like the Webster Dictionary of queer is, I can't remember what the language is. It has nothing to do with sexual orientation. It has to do with just like a little odd, you know, which again isn't helpful when we're trying to, if somebody goes to the dictionary to try to understand what queer is, that's not gonna help. That's not helpful. Great question. I mean, as long as I feel like we have some intergenerationalness happening in this room, I think it was your point, I don't know who said this, when we used the term queer in the 60s and 70s, it had a very different meaning than it does now. I don't know when, but what I know is when I went to undergrad in the 90s, the student organization was called Quest, Queer Unity for EMU Students. And then that was the early 90s, which is further away than I remember. Like every time I'm like, which was about 15 years ago. It wasn't. So I don't, I think, again, it's been evolving, but I think in the 90s it kind of took off in that. And I'll send Darcy, there's some really good, there's one op-ed piece about the word queer that I found to be really, really helpful. And it was exactly this, that here's who's using it, here's who isn't using it, here's when we should use it, here's why it might be problematic. So that's helpful. All right, I'm gonna move us forward. Let me check. We're doing great. So gender, you can go one more forward. These are words. I'm gonna show you something. Maybe you've seen it before. It's a helpful tool to talk about gender. The way that I like to kind of just preface this is that there's really 2 things we're usually talking about, which is someone's identity, their gender identity, and their gender expression. 2 different things. Identity, as you can read on here, is your sense of being, male, female, and then what? Neither. Maybe you are neither, maybe you are both, or other genders. Everybody has a gender identity. If that middle sentence is tricky, don't worry, there's gonna be a visual aid. Then gender expression, and that is the physical manifestation of the person you see in front of you, in clothing, in hair, in style. And so this next, you maybe have seen this before, you can go ahead. Gender unicorn, it's very helpful. And again, Tesser, the folks created it, and this has been an evolution as well. Where it started and where it is now are wildly different. So I'm gonna walk you through this, and even if you can't see it, this is another thing that I can send so that you can have. But up top, those 2 things are the same things that were just on the screen, gender identity and gender expression. And so what this is saying, the gender identity has the rainbow and it's in the brain. That's how we identify ourselves. And what it's saying is that we can identify as a female, a woman, a girl, or a male, a man. Every time I say a mailman, then I'm like, it gets confusing. A man, a male, a boy, or other genders. We'll talk about that in a minute. Then gender expression are the green dots. And usually what that looks like is someone looks to be feminine in our understanding of femininity, or masculine, or other. And other a lot of times is androgynous. You know, like you look at somebody and you're like, I'm not sure. And so what this is saying is these are two different things. So I'm gonna do this for myself so that it can make sense, and then I'm gonna tell you a story. My gender identity is female. I'm a woman, I know that. There's no confusion for me about that at all. And my gender expression is somewhat masculine. I wear a shirt and tie to work every day. This is my haircut, right? But it doesn't shift my gender identity at all. And sometimes I get questions from people who are like, well, why do you want to look like a boy? And I'm like, well, that's not how that's not what happens in my brain. It's just what's more comfortable to me. If I had to wear a dress for some reason, it would be the most uncomfortable. I don't even know how to and there's only one time. Her name was Bree. I'm gonna name her in this space. She asked me to be in her wedding about 12 years ago. It was a bright fuchsia dress with matching heels. I've never worn heels on a golf course. And I was like, this doesn't feel like a friendship anymore. I didn't know then that there's other ways to do that, right? And I was just like, yes, of course, I'll do whatever you want. And that day, I looked ridiculous because it's not authentic to who I am. And it doesn't confuse who I am as a woman. So I was doing this presentation with a guy that I worked with for physician assistants at Eastern Michigan. And it was the first cohort of physician assistants. They had no curriculum on LGBT people, and they were about to be PAs in hospital systems. And so they had us come in to talk through this. And we did this part. And so I did the thing in front of them, and I was like, yes, I am, my name is Mary, I identify as a woman, my gender expression is. And then the next thing that you see here is sex assigned at birth. And that is not a candy wrapper, I learned. That's what I thought it was. It's a double helix. I'm not a scientist, okay? Sex assigned at birth, meaning the baby is born, and we say, oh, you had a boy. Oh, you had a girl. Or your child is intersex. We'll talk about that in a second. So we did this, and I said, I am a woman. I guess my gender expression is masculine, and I was assigned female at birth. Then he looks like a man, a dude man, a bro, they would say, a young bro. And he was like, my gender identity is a man, I am a guy. He is very masculine. He said, my gender identity is masculine. And then he shared that his sex assigned at birth was female. And the whole room had a moment. And I said, let's stop for a second. I appreciate that you all felt like you could respond that way. But what if he was in an emergency room and you learned of that information and your face went, oh. And some of them thought they were being kind by saying, we would have never known. Because in this moment, they're training to be physician assistants. And so I want to hold that space with them. Yes, we are all here to learn, but also gasping when you heard that information is something he's dealt with his whole life, right? And so, again, it was like, for them, it was good that we were in that space doing that. But I'll say that when we talk about gender, it's so vast and nuanced and different for lots of people. And so you have heard me use words like non-binary, trans. Sometimes those go together, sometimes they don't. Some trans people don't want to identify as trans. They want you to call them a man or a woman because that's what they are. Some trans people feel really strongly about their trans identity and they want to have that trans identity. It also looks wildly different across demographics. So trans men and this is a little outdated language, but just so we level set, who are assigned female at birth, transition, and identify as men, have it a little easier than trans women. Trans women historically, especially Black trans women, the most marginalized people in the world. For folks who are familiar, in November, there's something called Trans Day of Remembrance, and it is mourning the loss of those who were violently taken from this earth, and there are hundreds of them every year across the globe. And they are mostly trans women. Very rarely is it trans men. I could talk for an hour about why that's the case. But it is a really, when we talk about like things like the Jim Toy Center and the work that the center does and other centers, like it is some really hard and heavy and vulnerable work. And there are celebrations. And so I say that when Pride happens, sometimes for folks, there's not a lot of pride in what's happening based on the fact they've had a really hard time. And so again, we could spend quite a few hours talking about gender. And I'm gonna pause for a second. It used to not be this, it used to be an umbrella, and it said transgender across the umbrella, and then all these things were underneath the umbrella. And a lot of folks said, that doesn't make sense to me. As somebody who identifies, if they identify and they look at it and they say, it doesn't make sense to me. With the word, how many of you have heard of the word cisgender? Maybe less than half. Someone who raised their hand, I'm not looking at you. I didn't mean to. Somebody raise their hand. Are you willing to try to say what cisgender is? Yeah.
That I identify the way I was assigned.
Yes. So if I am making assumptions here, you identify as a woman right now, and you were assigned female at birth. So when you were born, they said, look, you have a baby girl, and baby girl identifies as a woman now. That is cisgender. We used to say that meant not trans. And trans people were like, can you just not use us in this as well? So cisgender is just that when you're looking up here, if your sex assigned at birth aligns with the gender that you're walking around the earth right now. And so there are all of these spectrums that exist. So for instance, gender non-conforming versus gender non-binary. Different things. And it can sound different depending on who's talking about it. Gender non-conforming, one might say that I as a woman am non-conforming to our societal standards of what a woman should look like. Non-binary, and again, there are a lot of ways, but for our time here today, non-binary means not male or female, because the binary is man and woman, male, female. So non-binary is saying, that doesn't work. That doesn't work for me. And the word trans might not work. Non-binary means when we go back one slide, sorry, I didn't tell you I was gonna do this. Can we go back one slide? That middle part where it says neither of these, both, that's a good way to think about non-binary. That they might not align with what it means to be a man or a woman. And for folks who have only known that your whole life, that can sound tricky. Like, well, what does that mean? And again, I would just say, let it play out. Because it matters, identity matters. And if somebody knows that about themselves and they're sharing that information with you, consider yourself to be a trusted person with that.
I think there's a real hardship when a man is becoming a woman and then goes and plays on a women's sports team.
You and a whole lot of other people. There's lots of threads on the internet about that.
I mean, it really ruins it for the other team that is all the size of that.
Yeah, so, and again, I am not an expert at women in sports or trans folks in sports, but I can't remember the person's name most recently that was in the news. And there was a lot of really great research and stories. So there's a few things that I would name in this. A lot of folks share your concerns. There's also lots of conversation about bathrooms that's a whole nother training, okay? That's another conversation for another day. And the only thing I'll say about that is it's fear. It's fear. That's all that's happening. Show me where trans people are preying on small children or other, like that's not happening. What we are worried about are people who are deviant in some capacity, and somehow we're thinking that that's about trans people. Like I remember when Target decided to have gender neutral restrooms and the world exploded. Like everybody was like, well, and again, it's fear and it's okay. And I want people to feel safe always. I think the best option, and this is now what happens when you have a microphone, you can say whatever you want. I think the best option for restrooms is to have a single stall that you go in, you turn around, you lock the door, you do what you need to do, and you walk out. That's it. It's so easy. I used to say this, so I presented to the Board of Regents at EMU when we were talking about gender neutral restrooms. And I don't love this, but you have to figure out another way. You can't talk about trans people. So I'd say things like fathers who are taking their daughters to the bathroom, families, differently abled folks, restrooms for our international students who aren't used to being in communal spaces. And if that still didn't work, this is literally what I said to the Board of Regents. How many of you like to just take a poop by yourself? And it worked. They were like, yeah. I'm like, great. You know that feeling when you're like, I'm safe right now? That's all we want for everyone. And the easiest way to do that is to just let someone go in a room, lock the door, and finish, to come back out. So to that point, again, with the women in sports, what I know to be true, there aren't, and I'm not saying you said this, there aren't men that are just wanting to compete out there that are like, I'm gonna transition so that I can play on a women's sports team. So I wanna put that away. And we're not seeing that there's some, what's that word that I'm looking for? Like they're not doing that much better. The trans women are not doing that much better than the other folks. It is a conversation to be had. School systems, like this is heavy in school systems right now. And it's interesting, how many of you have ever heard of or seen like a young woman who wants to play on the football team, and there's not a girls' football team? So they say, okay, there's not another option for you, so okay. It's really not any different than somebody wanting to do that, and we say, okay, well, I guess let's give that a try. Tricky, but again, this is why like the conversation can always go like 15 different ways. And we're always trying to catch up to what's happening. And I think for the most part, people, well, not all people, are trying to do the right thing, and sometimes we find out later that we didn't think it through all the way. Like the Title IX stuff in the NCAA, and they're like, oh, hold on, where we start to put parameters in place for equity and equality. But I say all of that, don't let that get you caught up in those small micro conversations that people have. How many, now I know how many people here have the internet? Okay, how many people have seen stories where there's comment threads or a Facebook post where there's comment threads and everyone piles on with their opinion, right? It is fascinating to me the things that people have opinions about. So my brother and I could not be on different sides of every spectrum known to person, he has 3 daughters that I love, and they love me, and we have to figure it out. When something happens in the world, he'll put something out on social media, and I put something out, and everyone thinks one of us is unhinged. Because how can that be the same story? How can we look at that? And that's how it all works, right? We take in meaning, we see something, and based on our lens, we filter it, and then we make sense of it. And it can look wildly different. But what I say to him when he posts things about like black trans women, I'm like, wow, how many do you know? And the answer is like none. He's never had a conversation or seen a black trans woman in his life, but he has so much to say about that. And those are where I ask people, find a way to intervene in that. Like, I don't let him just out there saying, and sometimes I do it in kind ways, but how do you keep yourself safe and sane, but also when you see something or hear something that you know, just hold on a second, I don't think that's right. How do we engage in that? Because that's, to me, the each one teach one mentality. When I say that, when I go into a medical grand rounds with doctors, I say, sure, I'm here to help you with your patients, but I'm also here to help you at your dinner table with your teenager. Because that's really what it's about. It's not just about the place and space that we take up. So, oh, he left. What? It's hard to find good help these days, you know? Let me look. Okay. So, again, I use this for so many different things. A culture of inclusion and belonging. What does it mean? And so what I have heard, and I've heard this when I was asked to come here, you bet I asked around first. I was like, what's it like there? I know Darcy, so I knew that, like, okay, like I'm not being asked to come into, like, whatever that would be, right? That's not here. But I did want to know, like, what do people think? Because I've seen, again, like rainbow flags, or seen like the inclusive statements that exist. And it sounds like there's a really good foundation here, for the most part. There's just a learning curve, maybe, at times. Or what we think is inclusive, maybe other folks don't feel the same. And I talk about this at Trinity. Trinity is not a hospital of choice for LGBTQ people because it's Catholic. That's just the way it works. Churches, regardless of what we say they are, have a fight in front of them to really allow people to believe that this can be a place that they belong, because many churches have weaponized that. No, you belong here. And there's other things, but I said I'm not talking about the Bible, so I'm not going to do that. But that's not how it feels, and I'm not saying that here. But these are the ways that I say it's not rocket science. All we have to do is, and you can flip forward, the second one is the one I really want to stay on. Expectation setting. This, not as much here, but whenever I'm talking to people who are like therapists, social workers, and they're like, well, I don't know, it was the first time I met with this person, this client, and in the first 10 minutes, they got so upset with me. And I say, well, you don't know what happened the day before, the years before, when they were 13 and 14, so if you asked a question that didn't feel aligned, or it felt a little, you bore the brunt of that in that moment. And so I always just say, don't make it personal. Remember that there's a person in front of you who is probably hurting at some point, and in that moment, you were in front of them. And so we can move forward, because the next one is the one that I really want to take a second. Pronouns. Lots of talk about pronouns in the world, and preferred names. So one thing, we used to say preferred pronouns. We don't say preferred. They're pronouns. We just should use the pronoun that people want. How many folks here identify with the pronoun he? So you use the word he for yourself. You're a man, and when I talk about you, you would think that I say he. How many folks she works for you? You're like, yep, that works. How many folks use the term they? How many folks struggle with the term they for a singular person? Great job. Great job. If you have spent your whole life hearing and knowing that they means multiple people, it gets tricky. First year that I worked at EMU, I had a speaker come in, they used they. When I called the hotel to make a reservation for them, I could have just said he or she to make it easy, but what did I tell you? You should use the language regardless if the person's around or not. So I said they, and they said, how many? And I said one, and we just kept going back and forth. It was like, who's on first? I was like, no, it's just one person. We don't need 2 rooms. It's just, because people associate that with multiple people. Now, this is not new. We've been using they now for quite a while. And I'm gonna give you an example of when you've probably used it for one person and you didn't know. If everybody got up and left right now, and you and I are the only people in the room, and I come over, no, I'm not gonna use yours, hold on, and that phone is still sitting here. I pick that phone up, I come over to you and I said, somebody left their phone. I have no idea if the person's male or female. So I say they and their, and no one bats an eye. It's really only when we're talking about trans people that folks start to be like, or gender, that folks are like, that doesn't work. But we actually say they quite often, and we don't realize it.
But it's also in the written form, and that's what
Yeah.
we were all corrected.
In English class after English class, yes.
So I find myself when I'm reading the pronoun they, them, the pronoun
Yep.
they, I find myself having to reread that a number of times to try to make sure,
Yeah.
what is it exactly I'm reading.
Well, and like the guidelines, like Purdue OWL, for folks who, that's a resource for like college students that are writing papers, the guidelines are shifting. Very clear that they is absolutely okay to use for a singular person. And think about, so for instance, like I am someone who writes a lot of reference letters. And I write a lot of reference letters for LGBTQ folks because they were students at EMU. And so I always have to ask them, what do you want me, because you know how many times you use he or she in a reference letter? Like through the whole thing. And so I don't want to make the assumption because I know that they use they, that they want me to put that in a reference letter to their new employer. But also, they might not want to be misgendered from the get-go. So if the first time a hiring manager is reading he, and then the person comes to work there, it's harder to shift your brain if you've already associated a gender with a person. That's true. We know that to be true. And so this is where, and there's others. These are only 3. If I was here for 3 more hours, I would tell you about all the other pronouns that people use.
Our daughter helped me. She said, when you're on the road, you would easily say, stay away from them, they're a terrible driver. That's one driver.
You don't know who's in the car, right?
I said, I started thinking about that. I'm like, yeah, we used it all our life.
Yeah, because it's changing the way that we think about gender in some ways, it's hard, I think. And I say, so the bottom part here, how many folks were raised that saying sir and ma'am is respectful? You should say sir and ma'am. So this is not only, again, intergenerational, culturally. So I did a session in Austin, Texas some years ago for 70 students. Out of the 70 students, 60 some of them were Black students. Lots of sir and ma'am below the Mason-Dixon line, right? Like they have been told their whole life, especially for young Black boys. Like, you better call a sir and ma'am. So I show up and I'm like, ooh, this is gonna be tricky. Because I work at predominantly white institutions, I'm used to that. And so I'm introducing myself and I'm trying my best. And we are in the middle of like this really high energy, fun thing. And this young man, I got so excited for him and I said something, he was like, thank you, sir. And he's like, I don't know why I just said that. And I was like, it's okay, because that makes more sense than ma'am to me. Like, I'm not mad at you. Now, granted, I know that I'm probably a little kinder. You know, there's people who, when that happens, that's not the case. But I don't want, he recognized it, right? In that moment, he was like, oh, sorry. And so it's hard. Like, everyone that I work with at Trinity knows, do not introduce me. Don't say sir and ma'am. And again, this is just about me. I'm not saying that, like, but using those terms, I don't feel seen if I am coming off a meeting with another person and they're like, thanks, ladies, or ma'am, or miss, even though I told you I know I'm a woman. That's confusing. Like, people are like, you said you're a woman. Why don't you like ma'am? Or it just doesn't land. And so this piece down here, the Mr., Miss, Ms., there is a gender neutral suffix. You don't need to know about it. You don't need, I mean, really, people don't say it often. They write it. But MX, mix, MX is a gender neutral term that women use. What I learned, it's been here since the 70s because women did not want to be identified by their relationship status. Men are always Mr., no matter who they're with. Mr., 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 Mr. But women, it was Miss, Mrs., but that genderness sometimes complicates things because that's no different than pronouns. So using and saying those. And again, if you're like, oh, it's just too much, all you have to know is that it exists. And that the more time, so if we say that we are an inclusive place, I don't care where the place is, whether it's a church, whether it's a school, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a police department. If people have to choose, if they have to check boxes where they don't see themselves represented, it's not inclusive. I don't know what that is here. I'm not saying that that exists, but I talk about that a lot. Like the diversity, equity, and inclusion application for Trinity Health has male, female, other. Other is not inclusive. Other is, well, you're not those, so check this other thing. And so I say to them, like, we are the DEI team. Like, if we're not doing it right, how can we expect other people to do that right? And even if it doesn't make sense for you or someone else, it doesn't matter. And so we have this conversation I do with my boss all the time. She's like, I just don't want to have to explain to everyone why we're doing it. We don't have to, because those aren't the people that are checking the box. The people that are checking the box need it. Like, that to me is simple. And it is an educational moment if somebody wants to take that, to say, oh, well, would you look at that? So I'm going to stop. I think we are close to, yeah, it's 12:32. But I could keep going for hours. I can come back in June. But I want to offer questions that might feel unanswered right now. Yeah.
You got a little bit into allyship 5 minutes ago. Is there anything else that we should be aware of? Things we should be doing?
Like to feel like, yes, this is an inclusive space for folks. And yeah, and it's so fascinating, that piece of, and you know, around allyship, if we consider ourselves to be allies and we're trying to do that work. So yes, it is helpful to have things like pins and rainbow, right? Anyone who is looking to know if a space is for them sees that kind of stuff. You know, they're like, yes. The thing, like I said, I don't know what kind of systems. It sounds like, oh, well, we were joking about this, like, because when I saw that the sermon, the what's it called that you were all at, church, was on the TV when I came in, I was like, oh, it's really high tech here. Like, I hadn't been in a church in a minute. And I was like, it's very high tech. Any place and space where you're like, oh, you know what? Yeah, I bet that wouldn't feel great. Even the things, so if you're having a program or an event, how we title those, who it's for. I literally just had this conversation with a Lutheran church. They have a women's Bible study, and that's all it says. And they say that they're really inclusive, and they have folks who are non-binary that go there. And I'm like, does it need to be a women's Bible study? Or if we're gonna say women's, can it say like anyone who identifies as a woman? And or have we asked if non-binary folks or LGBTQ folks want their own Bible study? And the answer was no. And so it was like, okay, it's those sorts of things. They also had another, it was like a singles meet and greet, and they did a battle of the sexes. Right? And so I was like, how fun. I hear how fun you want that to be, but then you invite people in who you said belong here, and now you're asking them to, if you're a man, go over here, and if you're a woman, go over here, and we're gonna play battle of the sexes. And it was like, that's not, you know, and so it's hard because there's not a fast and hard rule other than observe it, pay attention to it, know it, so that you can say, all you have to do, and it's one of the last slides, it says, don't be afraid to correct folks. Or to question it, to say like, hey, do you think we might be missing something here? Or who could we be impacting using that language? Because that's the way to change things and shift things, is to encourage folks to have those hard conversations. Yeah.
I know we're running a little bit late, so I'm not going to ask a question, but just a comment. You know, kind of the bottom line with a lot of this is homelessness among youth. And I know that Ozone House,
Yep.
the local youth shelter, they're probably between a quarter and a third, maybe closer to a third now, of the kids in their shelter have been thrown out.
Yep.
And so, you know, this has real life and death implications in terms of where people live, how their parents treat them. And so that is kind of what I think is, you know, a very important bottom line issues that you've been raising. And so, you know, I think we all ought to probably take a look at the Ozone House website. We all live,
Yep.
most of us, in Washtenaw County, and take a look
I absolutely agree with that. Trinity, I was thankful, said yes to hosting a conversation before the holidays, just about how challenging it can be for LGBTQ, especially youth, even in good homes. And good being like, you'll have a young person be like, they're all right, like my family's all right, it's not terrible. But there's literally websites for youth to go to at the holidays so that they know how to have a plan to get out of a situation. And it doesn't have to be violent. If it just feels terrible, that's enough. If you don't feel seen and heard, that's enough to say, I don't want to be here. And so I say that, how many of you hosted a holiday dinner or whatever for your family, and maybe they brought a friend or whatnot? Similar to what you said, we can be that change for a person who gets invited into our space. We can be that change. And that's really what I think about, and I appreciate you landing that because it is serious. I said I don't say there are LGBTQ issues, but there are, especially with youth. So thanks for that. Yeah.
Thanks so much for a very engaging professional talk. Talking of profession, when I saw you work at Trinity Health and you talked about what you did, I found myself thinking, because I remember about 2 decades ago when there was talk of a unification between the University of Michigan Health System and St. Joe's. It came to nothing because of quote-unquote philosophical principles, philosophical disagreements, which was obviously code for some obvious disagreements on partner issues. I'm curious, what's happened in those 2 decades, and does that, in your opinion, sort of map some really significant social change, or is it just an accident in one particular working environment?
I think a little bit of both. Literally, I would say they didn't even have a DEI team, I think, 11 years ago. 10 years ago, they had 2 people, and they both came from Michigan Medicine. So they were doing DEI work in a healthcare system, but they didn't have a DEI title. And so the senior vice president of DEI at Trinity brought other folks over from Michigan Medicine that they knew, and we are in the 5th year of the first strategic plan for DEI. The same conversation happened when St. Joe's wanted to open on Eastern's campus. Students protested because they were like, and again, if I had not worked there or consulted, I probably would have thought the same thing. I would have been like, that's not for us. But I was a patient for 20 years, and I was able to say, I had a really good experience, and now that I'm there. And so I think it was a bit of both. It was a bit of an accidental, and I think they knew as a leading healthcare system, get on the bus. We can't just be a healthcare system. So I don't have a solid answer, but I am seeing that shift, and I can tell you what, I wouldn't still be there 4 years later if that's not what was happening. If I would have gotten there and that wasn't, if it was just for show. I'm not good at that. So I want to release you out into the world because the sun is shining, and I have a cat film festival go to at the Michigan Theater. So I gotta, thanks.